Hey folks, today we're going to tear down, clean, and reassemble an Apex Elite reel from Ardent Fishing. Stick around. Hello fishing friends, I'm Keith from Chicken Thigh Fishing. Welcome aboard. In today's reel cleaning, we are going to disassemble, clean, lubricate, and reassemble an Apex Elite reel from Ardent Fishing. Before we get started, just a couple of quick tips that I always like to give on my reel cleaning videos. And the first one is have a phone available. Everybody's got a phone. Have your phone nearby so you can take a couple of photographs during the process of disassembly. That comes in quite valuable when it comes time for reassembly when you're new at this and you're not quite sure where all the parts go. I also recommend having a manual handy that came with your reel. If you got it in a box, it typically comes with a manual that has a blow-up photograph of all the components of your reel. And that can come in very handy when it comes time to looking at different parts if you're not that familiar with them. So it's always a good idea to have that. If you don't have one, if your reel didn't come with one, all you got to do generally is go to the manufacturer's website, and you're usually able to download and print a schematic of the components of your reel. So I recommend doing that before you get started. The other thing I recommend is using a movable surface. I use a cookie sheet, and I put a bright colored cloth on it, like this chamois cloth here, so it contrasts against the parts well, and that just makes it easier to see all the parts, and it makes it less likely that you're going to have a part go somewhere where you can't see it. Now, the reason you want to work on a movable surface, especially when you're new to tearing down a bait casting reel, is it's going to take you at least an hour or so to do the job completely. And a lot of times you may get called away or you have to leave for something, and if you do, you certainly don't want to have all the parts of your reel laying out on a kitchen table or something. So if you have it on a movable surface like a cookie sheet or any similar surface like that, and you have to leave, you can always pick it up and get it out of harm's way. You can put it on top of the fridge or down in your basement in a garage or whatever, and then you won't have to worry about pets or kids getting into it. And when you come back, you can resume your project of dismantling and reassembling the reel. So I recommend having a phone, having your manual available with a blow-up photo of the parts, and working on a movable surface. With that said, let's get cracking on this Apex Elite reel. Now the first thing we're going to do is remove the palm side plate. Now on the Apex Elite, there is a spring-loaded pin that engages with the palm side plate, and that is released by a screw over here. You should be able to release it by hand, but if not, it's got a slot for a slotted screwdriver. And all you need to do is unscrew that, and you will see that there is a spring there, and that releases the spring tension, so you are able to rotate and remove the palm side plate. Once you have the palm side plate removed, you can remove the spool. So when we flip over to the handle side of the reel, we're now going to remove the handle assembly, the star drag, and the handle side plate. The first thing you're going to want to do here is take out the handle nut retainer screw. And once you remove that screw, that will enable you to remove the handle nut retainer, and usually that will just come off with gravity. If not, if it sticks to that, all you have to do is grab a small flathead screwdriver and you can kind of pry it off and pop it off that way. After the handle nut retainer is the handle nut. And for that, you're generally going to need a 10mm wrench or any type of small adjustable wrench that you may have on hand. Now, If you are a lefty like me, and if your handle is on the left-hand side of your bait casting reel, you need to be aware that tightening and loosening that nut is in reverse. It's not right, tight, left, loose like everything else in the known universe. It's reversed. So I'm going to turn it right to loosen it, and you just have to crack it, and then you can remove it. Now you want to be cognizant of that, because if you turn it the wrong way and you put any amount of force into that, these nuts are pretty easy to strip. So if your handle's on the right side, it's regular. If your handle's on the left side, it's reversed. Now that we have the handle nut removed, we can go ahead and remove the handle. Now underneath the handle will be the handle washer or clip. In some cases, when you remove the handle, you're not going to see it right there, and the reason will be because it's stuck to your handle. More often than not, because of the oil and the grime and the dirt that gets in there, that washer sticks to your handle. So if when you remove the handle, you don't see it right here, it's going to be stuck to the back of your handle. And so now I can remove that clip type washer and put that aside. The next order of business is to remove the star drag, and removing the star drag is as simple as unscrewing it. And again, I'm going to turn it to the right to loosen it. Now after the star drag is removed, you're going to come into a series of washers here. And in this reel, the washers sit inside another washer called the click washer. It's a washer that has sides to it, and it's got a spring in it called the click spring. And you're going to want to take that off. And inside will be a washer that you want to take out. And so you have the washer and the click washer. And then underneath that, we're going to have our curved washers. On your bait casting reel, you will have two washers that have curves to them. That is to say, if you hold it up sideways like this, you'll see that it has a little bit of a curve. Now it's important that when you remove those, you want to keep those in the same orientation so you can reassemble them in the same orientation. So I took them off both at a time. I freed them up with this little screwdriver, and there are two of them, and I'm going to place them down in the same order that I removed them. And so one is kind of curved this way and the other one is kind of curved this way, and so I'm going to keep them like that. And when I pick them up to clean them later, I'm going to make sure I'm aware of that, and I clean them and I put them back down in the same orientation that I picked them up in. So the next thing that we're going to want to remove is the palm side plate pin with the spring on it, and that simply slides out, and we can keep that over here with the palm side plate. And now we're going to be ready to remove the handle side plate. Now the palm side plate was held in by that spring tension pin. Your handle side plate is going to be secured by screws. And on this reel, that handle side plate is secured with 1, 2, 3 screws. Now typically on most bait casting reels, you're going to have 2 or 3 or 4 screws on the outside, and you're either going to have 1 or 2 or 3 screws on the back side as well. This reel only has 3 screws on the outside in order to remove the side plate. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those screws. Now that I have those screws removed, you're going to see that I laid them out in the same pattern that I removed them from the handle side plate. And that's important because when you go to put those back in during the reassembly, you're going to want to make sure they go in the correct holes, because oftentimes on a reel, even though they appear to be the same size, you have different length and different diameter screws. So it just makes it that much easier on reassembly to have them in the pattern so you know which hole they go in. And so now I'm going to remove that handle side plate, And when it comes to removing the handle side plate, depending on how dirty your reel is, it may stick a little bit. So you may have to use a little bit of force to pop it free, but you want to make sure that you do so under control. So after I have that handle side plate removed, one thing I want to point out here, the next thing you're going to have is a sleeve that goes over the main gear shaft here. Now oftentimes that sleeve isn't on the main gear shaft when you take off the handle side plate. It remains stuck here in the clutch. So you want to be cognizant of that. So if you remove the handle side plate and this sleeve is not on the main gear shaft, it's because it's still in here, and all you have to do is pop it out and pull it out. So in this case, the sleeve remained on the main gear shaft, so I'm able to put the handle side plate aside and go ahead and remove the sleeve. Now once we have the handle side plate and the sleeve removed, now would be a good time to take a photograph with your phone so you can see the orientation of all the interior parts on the handle side of the reel. Just helps you if you need to refer to it later. I mean, the process is pretty simple and you shouldn't need it, but in case you do, you'd rather have a photograph to be able to refer to. So the first part of disassembly on this part of the reel is going to be the pinion gear and the yoke. The yoke will have two posts on it that have springs, and you're simply going to remove those two springs off the posts. And once you do that, you can grab hold of the pinion gear, and you just have to tip up the main gear a little bit, and that will allow you to be able to remove the pinion gear and the yoke. And you can see how dirty those components are. This reel is definitely in need of a cleaning. Now the pinion gear consists of a fatter end and a skinnier end, and you want to be aware that that fatter end goes down. So when you pull it out, be aware that that's how that goes. And the yoke has a middle section that fits into the groove on the pinion gear, and that's how they mate together. So I'm going to separate the yoke from the pinion gear and lay that down. Now the next order of business is the drag washer and the main gear assembly. And all you're going to do is pull that off. Again, you may encounter a little bit of resistance, but not too much. If you do encounter some resistance because it's stuck in place, you just want to make sure again that you use control, because you don't want to really force that off there and end up sending any parts flying. So as I lift up the main gear and the washer assembly, I'm going to reach underneath and hold it like a sandwich, because what's going to happen is typically the bottom pieces are going to be stuck to the washer. So you'll see here that the ratchet in this bottom washer was stuck to the bottom of the main gear. So I'm going to place that ratchet and washer over here, and now I'm going to take the top components off, and I'm going to be sure to keep them in the order that I removed them. And you want to be careful, and when you take them off, you want to make sure that there's not another part stuck to the other side. So we have the first washer, and we have the second washer, and we have the main gear. Now on this reel, the washer that goes between the main gear and the ratchet is actually adhered to, it feels like it's glued to it, so I'm not gonna pull that washer off. Now it may just be stuck to it, but when I lifted it up a little bit, I noticed that there appears to be some kind of adhesive in there, and so it looks like they want this washer to be adhered right to the ratchet. In most cases that's not the case. In most cases on different reels, that washer will slide right off the ratchet and it'll be a different component. But on this reel it looks like it's supposed to be that way. In any event, I'm going to keep it in place. Now one thing you want to pay attention to here is that when you remove that ratchet, the ratchet has teeth, and the teeth face a certain direction. In this case, they are turning to the left. You want to make sure you keep that in the right orientation when you take it out, when you lay it down, when you pick it up and clean it, and then when you reassemble it. Because if you put that washer on incorrectly and with the teeth facing the opposite way, your reel's not going to work properly. You're going to have to disassemble it again in order to flip that over. In this case, it'll be easy to remember because we know that the side with the washer adhered to it is going to be facing up. On other models of reels, that washer isn't attached to it, so it's kind of a little bit easier to flip it over and have those teeth facing the incorrect way. But this way should be easy since we're going to leave that washer on the ratchet. So now that we have the drag washer and main gear assembly removed, we're going to go ahead and remove the main gear shaft and the bearing plate. And that's held in by 2 screws. Now you may want to take a photograph here so you can see the orientation of these components on the handle side of the reel. But I just removed those screws, and so now I can lift up the main gear shaft and the bearing plate. Now you can disassemble the bearing plate, and the gear from the main gear shaft, but it's really not necessary, and it's just another step you would have to take. And I subscribe to the notion that you want to take apart as little of your reel as possible and still get an effective cleaning and lubrication. You can sufficiently lubricate and clean the bearing plate and the bearing underneath here without dismantling this, so I always keep that together as one unit. So we'll put that right aside. Now the next thing we are going to be able to do here, now that we have the palm side plate and the spool removed, and we have the handle side plate and the assembly on the handle side removed. Next thing we're going to go to is the front of the reel, and we're going to remove the worm gear and the level wind mechanisms. Now in order to do that, the first order of business is to remove this hood, this decorative piece of plastic that goes over the front of your reel. And that is going to be held in by a screw on the palm side and a screw on the handle side. Now once you have those 2 screws removed, you should be able to easily remove the hood. Now that we have the hood removed, we can go ahead and proceed with the worm gear assembly and the level wind guide assembly. So what we're going to do here is remove the level wind guide nut, and if you can't get that by hand, it has a slot for a slotted screwdriver, and all you have to do is crack that to loosen it. And then you can remove the level wind guide nut. Now typically there's going to be a spacer in there, and the spacer either usually sticks to that pawl in there or it stays inside the cap. And it looks like there's one inside the cap, so I'm just going to leave that in there. Now what you have inside this pocket is the worm gear pawl, and we're just going to drop that out into our palm using gravity, and that will fall out, and that pawl goes in that hole. And so now the level wind guide is no longer engaged with the worm gear, so you'll see that it moves freely. And so now we will be able to remove the worm gear and the worm gear tube, and you want to be cognizant that the gear side is on the handle side of the reel, and the other bearing side has an E-clip that holds it all together. So the first thing in order to remove that worm gear is to remove the E-clip on the palm side of the reel. And now that E-clip is small, and it's got a couple little notches in it. So you're going to want to stick a small implement in there in one of the notches and pop it off. So once you get your tip of your screwdriver into the notch in order to pry it off, just cover it with your hand, and you can pop it off. So when I popped it off, it flew into my hand, and I just go ahead and put that aside. Now underneath that clip, you're going to find a spacer, and if you can't readily get that off, we can just get it off when it falls off. So I'm going to move to the other side, the handle side of the reel, and now that that E-clip is off, this side will be able to move, as you can see there. And so you can push the gear down and expose the small pin that holds that gear into place. And you can see that's a very small pin. And I can then remove the gear. So now that I have both sides released, I can push this out. I can grab hold of this bearing over here and pull the worm gear out. And now I'm going to be careful to remove the bearing and the spacer. You see, when I pulled that out, the spacer fell over here. So on the palm side of the reel, we have the E-clip, the spacer, and the bearing. On the handle side of the reel, we have the pin, the gear, and there's also another bearing inside there, and we're going to get that in a minute. But prior to that, I want to show you the worm gear. Now the worm gear will only go in one way. So on this reel, it only goes in the palm side and it goes in this direction. And now an easy way to remember that is on the end of the worm gear, you'll see a hole. And that hole is for the pin that secures the gear on that side. So if you get the orientation mixed up when you're cleaning it, you know that the hole goes on the gear side because that's where the pin and the gear go. So now that I have that worm gear out, I'm going to want to remove the worm gear tube. And now on this reel, the worm gear tube has a retainer here that's held in by a screw. So I'm going to remove that screw. You'll see that retainer secures there. And now I am able to remove the worm gear tube, and in doing so, that frees the level wind guide. Now on the level wind guide, you will see that that big hole is where that worm gear tube goes through. The small hole accommodates the palm side plate pin. That's what goes through there. The lower front hole is where the pawl goes in and engages with the worm gear, and the top hole is your line guide. That's where your fishing line actually comes off your spool and goes through there. So now I will take and remove the worm gear tube, and again, that will only go in one way, so you won't be able to put it in the other way, because you know that the retainer is on this side and it screws in to there. Now keep in mind, inside there is a bearing. We're just going to leave that in there, and I'm going to clean and oil that in place, but you want to be cognizant that that's in there. In the event that it comes out, you know where it goes. So you'll see I have this set up in the way that it's going to go back in when we reassemble. I have the worm gear with the hole on this side. I have the worm gear tube with the retainer on this side. And so on the handle side of the reel, you'll have the pin, the gear, and the screw for the retainer. And then on the palm side, you'll have the bearing, the spacer, and the E-clip that all secures that into place. So now that's as far as we are going to break this reel down. There's no need to break it down any further for routine maintenance and cleaning and lubrication. You can certainly break it down further if you wish, but as a word of caution, the parts get smaller and smaller as you go, and there's really no need for it unless something is broken, in which case I would send it to a real technician. But for maintenance and cleaning, this is all you have to break it down to. And so what we're going to do now is clean all the individual parts, and when we do so, we're going to make sure to pick them up carefully, clean them, get all the dirt, the old oil, the old grease off them, and put them down in the same position so they don't get all mixed up. Now you can see here why I was talking about having it on a movable surface. Now if I had to leave for any reason now, I wouldn't want all these parts sitting on my kitchen table or out in the open somewhere. I'm able to pick this up, put it away, and I can come back at a later time. So in cleaning, if you ask 100 people, you'll get 100 different answers on what the best thing is to use to clean a reel, or what their favorite thing is to use to clean reel parts. I just use Lysol or Clorox wipes. They've always worked fine for me. They get everything clean and they don't do any damage to the parts. So that's what works for me. So I'm just going to go through and I'm going to carefully pick up and clean each component and put it back in the same order that it was in. So we're done cleaning the parts, and as you can see, quite a bit of dirt, old oil, and old grease out of there, and she was certainly due for a cleaning. Now we're going to get right into the reassembly of the reel, and for the most part what we're going to do is we're going to do things in the reverse order that we disassembled in. So as I do this, generally I'm going to hold the reel housing facing myself, so the front of the body of the reel facing me, and that's how I maintain my correct orientation of the parts I'm going to put back on. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and insert the worm gear tube, and you will remember that that goes in the handle side of the reel. And there is a retainer here. But before I put that all the way in and secure that retainer, I'm going to have to reinsert the level wind guide, which has that big hole that the worm gear tube goes through. So once I have that, I can go ahead and insert the worm gear tube and seat it into the other end, the corresponding hole on the palm side. And then so once that retainer is in place and the hole is lined up, I'm going to take the screw, and it's a very small screw, so now the retainer for the worm gear tube is in place. Now we can go ahead and reinsert the worm gear itself. So you remember that it's got the hole for the pin that goes on the handle side, so I'm going to stick it in this way and through the bearing on that side. And now when it comes to reassembling the worm gear, remember one side had that E-clip that held it all together, so we're going to do that side last. So the first side of the worm gear we're going to assemble is the handle side. Now before I put the gear on, remember there's that bearing in there, and so I'm going to put a drop of oil on that bearing, and then I'm going to replace the gear itself. Now the gear itself has a nub on one side that fits down into it, and it has a notch, a groove on this side which that pin fits into. So that's going to go with that nub side down, and we're going to fit that right in there, and we're going to make sure that that worm gear end with the hole is sticking out far enough for us to be able to insert that pin. Now the pin can be a little tricky because it's so small, and if you have fat fingers like me, you might have difficult time manipulating that into the hole. If so, just use a pair of tweezers, but if you do, be careful not to put too much pressure on the tweezers, or you'll pop that little pin right out of the tweezers and across the room, and trust and believe, you will not find that pin. So I'm carefully going to put that pin into the hole on the worm gear, and then I'm going to just kind of manipulate it so it goes down flush into the groove on that gear. And all you got to do is really just turn it a little bit to get it to seat down in there. Okay, so now that I have that down in the groove, the worm gear and the pin are flush with that white gear, and so now I'm ready to flip it over and go to the other side. However, I want to be sure to keep that in place with my finger on the handle side, otherwise when I flip it over to do the palm side, that's going to fall right out. So I'm going to keep that in place with my finger, and I'm going to replace the bearing that goes in there. And again, I'm going to hit that bearing with a drop of oil. And then I am going to replace the spacer. And then I'm going to put the E-clip into position. And what I'm going to do is get it into position with a slotted screwdriver so I can pop it on. So I'll put a little pressure on it to keep it lined up. And once I get the edge of my screwdriver on it, I'm going to want to cup it with my hand and pop it on. And you really want to remember to cup that with your hand, because, you know, if you slide a little bit and you pop that on and it misses, if your hand's not cupped over it, she's going flying. So now I have the worm gear and the worm gear tube secured on the gear side and on the E-clip side, so the handle side and the palm side. And you'll see that the level wind guide is moving freely. And so what we're going to do to engage the level wind guide with the worm gear is reinstall the pawl. Now the pawl has two ears on it, and those ears go down, and what they do is they mesh with the grooves in the worm gear. And when you put that in, if it's not flush with the hole that you put it in, all you have to do is turn the worm gear, and those ears will find those grooves and seat down into the worm gear, and now you can see that it's flush. So once it's flush, you know it's in the proper position, and you can replace that cap. And you don't have to go too crazy tightening it. I'll just hand tighten it, and then I'll just tweak it. And so now you will see that's how that level wind guide works. It engages with the worm gear by means of the pawl, and that allows it to travel back and forth across the worm gear, and that's what evenly distributes your line across your spool on your bait casting reel. So now that we have the worm gear and the level wind guide in place, we can replace the hood. And these are super small screws, so I have better luck when I do them upside down like this. Okay, so now we are fully assembled with the worm gear, the level wind guide, and the hood. And so we can move to the handle side and the internal components there. So the first thing we're going to reinstall here is the main gear shaft. First thing we're going to do is hit that bearing with a drop of reel oil. And we're going to go ahead and put the bearing into the pocket that it goes into. We will mesh the two gears and line up the holes on the bearing plate, and then we will be able to replace the screws. Okay, so the next thing we are going to install is the yoke and the pinion gear. And now the yoke has two holes, and the two holes go over the yoke posts. And you will recall the pinion gear has a fatter side and a skinnier side, and the fatter side goes down, so it meshes with the yoke in the middle, and you put those two holes over the posts, and you are able to seat that down in there. Now the yoke will generally only fit in one way, but if you should put the yoke on and the posts aren't sticking up far enough to put the springs back on, then you know you have it upside down and you just have to flip it over. And so now we're going to replace those springs on the yoke post, and it's very important to remember those, because you tend to want to put those springs aside, and it's happened to me on several occasions where I've reassembled my entire reel, and then when I'm all done I notice I have two springs sitting on my cookie sheet here, and I have to disassemble all the way just to put the two springs on the yoke posts. So remember to put those springs on the yoke posts, and then you're ready for the drag washer and main gear assembly. So the first thing that's going to go on is the ratchet, and now you'll notice the ratchet, the middle of it has a kind of oblong rectangular shape to it, and that seats on the bottom of the main gear shaft. And you stick that right down there. Now we have the main gear. The main gear will go down the gear shaft and mesh with the pinion gear. If the pinion gear is leaning a little bit so that you can't get it down, all you do is tip the pinion gear a little bit and you will see that that meshes perfectly with the pinion gear. Now we're going to go for the drag washers. And we're good to go as far as that goes. So now I'm going to be ready for the handle side plate. But before I replace that, I'm going to put that sleeve back on the main gear shaft. And one thing you want to be cognizant about this sleeve is, at first glance, the ends look identical, but they are not. One end of the sleeve is circular, and the other end has two straight sides to it. It's kind of shaped like that oblong rectangle shape there. And so the side with the two flat sides goes up, and the circular side of the sleeve goes down. So I'm gonna make sure I put that on in the correct orientation and slide that down the main gear shaft. Now I'm ready to grease the gear, so I'm going to take my real grease, and I'm not going to use a ton of grease here, but I'm just going to put a little coating of grease on the outside edge of the main gear. And then I am ready to replace the handle side plate. Prior to replacing the handle side plate, I'm going to oil the bearings that are inside on the spool tensioner and on the clutch. And then I'm going to replace the handle side plate, get that into position, and then I know that this screw is going here, this screw is going here, and this screw is going here, and I can secure the handle side plate. Okay, now once I have the handle side plate on, I'm going to go ahead and hit that bearing with a drop of oil. I'm going to replace the washers. And the click washer. And then the last washer that goes down inside the click washer. And now I am ready to replace the star drag. I'm just going to hit that with a drop of oil. And now when it comes to replacing the star drag, it's a simple matter of screwing it on. But you want to make sure that it goes on easily like that. If when you go to put the star drag on, it has any resistance to it, that's usually because you have it cross-threaded. And it can be a little difficult sometimes to get that very first thread on the main gear shaft. So you want to make sure you have that on there so that it spins freely. If you do have some resistance, you want to stop what you're doing and start over, so you make sure you have that threaded on there true. Then I'm just going to tighten that down, and when you're tightening it, the level wind is going to want to move, so you just kind of hold that in place while you're tightening that down. So now I'm going to go over to the palm side. I'm going to oil that bearing and drop of oil on the pinion gear, and there's a bearing on the spool that I'm going to oil. I'm going to insert the spool and oil this side of the spool, and I'm going to replace the palm side plate, which also has a bearing for the magnetic brake dial. And I am going to go ahead and replace the palm side plate and put that into position. Now it's not secure because I still have the spring tension palm side plate pin out. And so what I'm going to do is make sure that the spring is on there, like that. And I'm going to go through the handle side. And now when this goes through, it has to go through the small hole on the level wind guide to make sure it's through to the other side. And once that goes through, I am able to push in on the spring and tighten that screw down. And I will just take and lightly tighten that with a screwdriver. And that's what secures that palm side plate in place. So now I'm ready to replace the handle assembly with the washer, the handle nut, which again, since we're working on a left-handed reel, is going to be left to tight, not right to tight. And again, you want to be sure of that first thread on there. If you feel any resistance, you want to stop and start over again, so you make sure you're not cross-threading that nut. I'm going to take my 10mm wrench and snug it down. I'm not going to go super tight. I'm just going to snug it down. And then I'm able to replace my handle retainer. And now if the hole doesn't line up on the handle retainer and the hole in the handle itself, you're just going to want to tweak it either to the right or to the left a little bit in order to allow that screw to go in, because if they're not perfectly aligned, that screw's not going to want to go in. So I'm going to take the handle nut retainer screw and tighten that down. And there we have it, folks. We have one reassembled Apex Elite reel from Ardent, and she is ready to go. Clean, quiet, smooth, just like new. This reel has been very good to me, and so I try to be good to it. So if you own an Apex Elite reel from Ardent Fishing, now you know how to disassemble, clean, lubricate, and reassemble it, and you don't have to send it out to somebody and wait 2 weeks for your reel. If you start taking apart your own reels and cleaning them, it's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of money, and when you get proficient at it, you can do this in about 45 minutes or so. I hope this video was a help to you. Thank you for being a part of Chicken Thigh Fishing, and we'll see you next time. Until then, stay fishing, my friends.